The Nintendo 64 has got plenty of classics and sweetened the pot for the Switch's online service quite a bit, but judging by the pure randomness we've seen from some of the NES and Super Nintendo offerings, I'd say we're in store for some obscure-ass 64 games before we get any of the true classics, and if you give me like 10 minutes to wildly speculate, I'll tell you what 10 of them might be. Number 1, BUMBLE. In the faraway distant year of 2010, a chemical factory in London's gonna have a leak that causes insects in the surrounding area to mutate. But thankfully, a single bumblebee by the name of Bumble volunteered to get cybernetic implants and fight back for the sake of all humanity, with the end result being well, average Nintendo 64 game. Might be loaded with all kinds of character and possibly the greatest video game theme song of all time, but sadly, this came out during a time period where the world was still kind of trying to figure out how to make that extra dimension fun in video games. But even beyond that, Bumble went a step further by adding grounded and aerial-based gameplay, so the controls and camera can be a little too frustrating to stand up to the test of time. Even so, it's still fun enough to toss into a mix of 64 games, and since Nintendo seems to be leaning towards those games that are dirt cheap to get the rights to, I could totally see this one ending up on the service sooner or later. Numero dos, Mischief Makers. Like I said, the 64 was a console that came from an era where everybody kind of felt like it was mandatory to make games in 3 dimensions. Then along came a game called Mischief Makers, a 2D platformer that basically told Nintendo CEO Barbara Nintendo to frig off.
Frig off, Burb.
Frig off?
Yeah, frig off, chill out, back off, mind your own business.
Excuse me?
Sure, you could call making a 2D platformer in the 64 lazy, but the reason why I think it took a whole lot of lady robot balls is because they actually made it really fun and utilized the 64's capabilities to push the 2D platforming genre forward, as opposed to just trying to pioneer something entirely new like every other game. Not that I don't appreciate what early 3D games did for the long haul, but whether you consider making a 2D game on the 64 to be bold or lazy, the fact is that most people skipped Mischief Makers back in the day, most likely because the average person viewed 2D gaming as obsolete. Eventually, though, people did end up realizing that new genres didn't mean that old ones had to be abandoned altogether, so I think the world's finally ready to give Mischief Makers a chance it deserves, and what better way than on the Switch's online gimmick thingy or whatever you call it. Number 3, TETRISPHERE. That's right, not even Tetris was safe from 3Dification, but then again, this isn't exactly the first time that happened either, but honestly, the end result here isn't really all that bad. It's pretty much exactly what you see in the gameplay, a Tetris-like puzzle game that you play in a rotating sphere, and like, this probably wouldn't be worth paying for as a standalone release at full retail price, given that it was just a puzzle game that was originally supposed to be released on the Jaguar, but as a hidden gem being randomly thrown into the 64 library on the Switch, I think a lot of people could have a lot of fun with this one, especially with online multiplayer. Number 4, Glover. Easily the greatest 3D platformer in the 64 where you play as a glove, Glover suffers from the same camera and control issues that most 64 games did. But even so, this is still pretty creative for its time. Despite playing as a glove with hands, the gameplay is mostly centered around his balls, and the idea is to keep him intact until you reach the goal in each stage. For whatever reason, the planned sequel got scrapped, which is a real shame too, because I feel like everything wrong with this game could have been improved with another crack at the formula. But since this is kind of the only glove-based game the 64 ever saw, I still think it's mandatory that Nintendo tries to lock it down for the service. Seeing as how the game got an updated port on the PC in 2022 though, it's probably a little less likely that Hasbro is willing to let the game just be given away by Nintendo. Still though, full-grown man can dream, can he? Number 5, Body Harvest. This game went through absolute hell just to see the light of day on the 64, but even though nobody really talks about this, the people who do will tell you that it's the most underrated game on the console, and if you ask me, it's definitely the most interesting one for sure. It's an open-world game about aliens returning to Earth every 25 years to feed on the human population, until finally a group of scientists had enough of this malarkey and decided not only to fight back, but also to travel through time to open up a can of ass whip and spray it all over the aliens in every different time period from the past and future, including on a comet in the distant future. It's basically Grand Theft Auto with aliens and time travel instead of carjacking and hookers, which isn't all that surprising considering that the game was actually made by Rockstar in the early days, and funnily enough, Nintendo was actually originally supposed to publish this game, but ultimately didn't because they felt like it was a little too violent for their tastes. I think we all know how leaving Rockstar high and dry worked out for Nintendo in the long run, so Body Harvest might be a little bit of a long shot, but since Rockstar's probably got their hands full with GTA, I doubt they're going to be taking the time to port something like this in the first place, so if Nintendo doesn't grab it, it's probably never going to see the light of day again, so, you know. I actually kind of think this one's got a pretty decent shot at coming to the Switch. Wishful thinking, I suppose. This one is a little bit of a long shot. Speaking of games made by Rockstar, though, number 6, Space Station Silicon Valley. Rockstar sure was hell-bent on this whole open-world concept, even back when they were known as DMA Design, and to be honest, they kinda nailed it with this one, but sadly, it just never caught on despite getting good reviews at the time. To make a short story even shorter, you play as a microchip named Evo, and in order to survive, you gotta stun animals and enter their brains and solve puzzles using all the different animals' abilities, and the game gets pretty friggin' creative here. Since it came out before the internet was really a thing in gaming though, you can't actually 100% it due to a bug that doesn't allow you to collect certain items, and I'm 95% sure that every copy's got this issue since it didn't really sell well enough to get more copies manufactured in the first place. So yeah, if they end up adding this, I really hope the bug isn't a part of the package deal, cause I really don't feel like using cheat codes to play a 25-year-old game. Number 7, Chameleon Twist. This game got duped on quite a bit back in the day for being too short for a full retail release at about 2 hours, but for a random game being thrown at you on the Switch that you may or may not get around to in the first place, I think it's perfect. In fact, I'd honestly be surprised to see this game not pop up, seeing as how Sunsoft already made offerings of the NES's library. The gameplay is entirely focused on using this humanoid chameleon's tongue that can be used to fight, pole vault, and swing your way around the stages, and the music's pretty solid too, which you'd hope would be the case, seeing as how like half the team consisted of composers. The game might not be too long, but I'm pretty sure everybody'd like it, plus it did end up making a sequel, so why the frig not Nintendo? Just give Sunsoft their flowers and put this game up before it's too late. Not sure what I meant by that, but hey, I said it. Number 8, Blast Corps. This is a pretty simplistic game where you pretty much just tear a bunch of buildings down, which has always been a popular genre in video games, especially during the era where Limp Bizkit made an entire friggin' song about it. The graphics hold up surprisingly well, and while the game is a bit on the easy side, it gets a little more complicated and adds some variety the more you play it, and since Nintendo managed to work a deal out with Microsoft and Rare for Banjo-Kazooie, I don't really think this one's too much of a stretch. And, speaking of Rare, number 9, Jet Force Gemini. Just like in the 90s, leave it to Rare to save the Nintendo 64 from being a barren wasteland of content, but as far as Jet Force Gemini is concerned though, this is probably the first Rare title that didn't exactly light the world on fire. It's a third-person action-adventure shoot-'em-up where you play as 3 characters who all have their own unique abilities, which offers a lot of replayability, but since you're replaying the same levels, you could argue that it drags the game out a little bit. Like, sure, there are alternate paths depending on who you choose, but seeing as how you pretty much have to go down these paths to fully complete all the levels, you do pretty much have a considerable amount of time tacked onto the experience repeating some stuff. As fun as this game is, though, it certainly can be frustrating, which is why I've never actually finished this myself, and apparently not many other people did either. But even so, the graphics are pretty fantastic, and despite Grant Kirkhope skipping this game for whatever reason, the soundtrack still ended up being pretty damn good. Plus, any retro game with respectable multiplayer gets a plus in my book when it comes to the Switch's online service, so hopefully this one makes its way over at some point. Number 10, Snowboard Kids. Mario Kart, Diddy Kong Racing, and F-Zero are all great racing games, but if you ask me what racing game I want to play on the 64, then more often than not, I'm picking Snowboard Kids 2, but the first one's still pretty good too. Made by Atlus of all people, these games have you playing as kids racing down mountains on snowboards, kinda in the same style as Mario Kart with items that you can use to sabotage your opponents, but rather than the game just giving you whatever you grab, you gotta have enough coins to buy the items, and if you're playing the first game, then you'll actually crash into the item boxes and lose a little bit of time. Sounds annoying on paper, and for your first time playing it probably will be, but I think it adds another layer of strategy to the mix personally. But my favorite thing about these games is the pure anxiety everybody gets when trying to reach the lift. You see, snowboarding usually takes place on hills, but if you're gonna have a lap system, then the only way you can do this is to have a lift that brings you back up to the top. However, if you're barely in second place and the person in front of you reaches the gate before you, then not only are you gonna crash behind them, but whoever's directly behind you is gonna have a good few seconds to snake your spot from you while you wait in pure agony for the gate to open again. Maybe hell when it happens to you, but the feeling you get when it happens to other people is so damn satisfying, whether it be forcing whoever's in second place to wait even longer, or snaking first place if they miss the gate and hit the wall. Even beyond all the strategic differences though, these games are loaded with charm, and even if you hate snow, there's still plenty of stages with none whatsoever. Why they insist on snow in the first place if they were gonna do that, I have no idea, but what I can tell you is that these games are both great multiplayer experiences if you want something different on the 64. And also, the second game's got a pretty good single-player campaign, so, you know, there is that too. But anyway, if you got a kick out of my incoherent rambling and disturbing imagery though, then you should check out my video on the entire Snowboard Kids series where I go into way more detail and add more toilet humor. If you'll excuse me though, I gotta go pay my egg bills on time before that guy Montana gives me another fractured ass. Later!